And here we are. So I called it Christianity in the West because Christianity has roots even in the ancient world, just all over the planet. And I couldn't do all the traditions at once. I couldn't do justice to the Ethiopian church, which was like the earliest church outside of the Levant, outside of Palestine, what we would think of as Palestine or Israel. I couldn't really do justice even to all of the Orthodox traditions, and certainly not the Asian tradition. So I decided to focus on European historical development, lots in the ancient world, in the Roman Empire, I should say. And the last session is going to look at an American 18th and 19th century phenomenon, the so-called Great Awakening. So here are the 6 sessions. This is why I call them episodes, because although they're all part of a larger continuity, each one has a certain level of isolation from the others. So I think of them as episodes. So the first session today is going to look at the foundations of the Apostolic Church, and we're really not going to get beyond the first century of the Common Era, but we're going to begin well into before the Common Era in Jewish tradition. The second session is going to look at 2nd through 4th century theological argument and the battle for orthodoxy within the church. And this is where things like definitions of the Trinity and the nature of Christ, which were topics for battling it out in the ancient world, as well as later on. But we will take a look at that period. And the third session is going to look at what happens as the empire falls and the church becomes the central institution for the early medieval period. One of the things we'll look at is the impact of paganism on Catholicism in that period. And then the fourth session is going to look at the rise of the militant papacy in the 11th century, which spawns the Crusades, both external Crusades to the Holy Land, but also internal Crusades against heresies, and really all inspired by a wave of spiritual and devotional reform that defines really the urban experience of the early towns, the medieval towns in the 12th and 13th century. In the fifth session, we'll look at the Protestant Reformation and Rome's attempt to counter it. And finally, in the sixth section, we'll look at what is called the Great Awakening and what I call the religion of the heart, or what some of the theologians at the time tried to create the metaphor of a religion of the heart versus a religion of the head, or an intellectual religion. That said, let's get to it. So we're going back to a period in the history of Judaism, the history of the Israelites, when it really became definably what we think of in the modern era as Judaism. And the significant event, of course, is the Babylonian captivity. So in the 6th century, the early 6th century before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabucodonosor of the Italian opera, and the Babylonians, they conquered the kingdom of Judah. They destroyed Jerusalem and the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, and they transport the population into captivity. And this is celebrated in literature and opera. It's the Psalm 137 that I quote here. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And of course, that becomes the great communal theme of the Verdi opera in Nabucco. Now, the Second Temple period is what is our point of focus, because Babylon falls later on in that century to the Persians, and Cyrus, Kyros the Great, permits the return of the Judeans to their home, and the temple is rebuilt. There's a Second Temple. The temple that will then last until there's a revolt against the Romans in the modern millennium in 70 AD or Common Era, and the temple will be destroyed by Vespasian and his son Titus as a punishment for the rebellion. In fact, there's a model of the Second Temple. And if you visit Jerusalem, you go to the Temple Mount, this is what you're looking at, the walls of this temple. So for 6 centuries, though, following the return from the Babylonian captivity, there is a Jewish state, but it is mostly 90% of that time, it's a tributary state. It's dominated by foreign powers, by Persia at first, by the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire, and this is one of the divisions of Alexander the Great's Greek Empire of the East, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Antigonids and the Seleucids in Western Asia, dominated what we think of as the Levant or Israel. And finally, after the Hellenistic period, the rise of the Roman Empire, which had been, as a republic, had begun to dominate that part of the world. But as an empire, just after the rebellions, just took control. And I just had to make sure everything was on mute. Now in the period we're looking at, Jewish resentment at being dominated because they had previously, before the Babylonian captivity, the kingdom of Judah had called the shots locally. There's resentment over the loss of power. There's yearnings for the glory days of David and Solomon. And there's the conviction, the ethnic and religious conviction that they were in a covenant with the one true God. And this led to several attempts, periodic attempts to throw off the foreign yoke. The rebellion of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC, and the first Jewish-Roman war of the 1st century AD were 2 notable uprisings. The mass suicide of zealots at Masada. It's just an indication of the kinds of the rabid nationalism that was often expressed in the Jewish world at this point in time. Now, another point of background in this period, because they were for such a long time in a part of the world that was living under the mantle of Alexander and the successor states, the Seleucids being one of them, that Greek influence was dominant. And it was dominant not just politically. The key here is that the Greek world, because of the intellectual tradition of early philosophy, the scientific tradition of early philosophy, as well, the great playwright tradition, which became a literate tradition. The Hellenistic world had a curriculum that was bequeathed to it by the early Greek city-states, Athens in particular. And it was, when I call it a curriculum, what I mean to suggest is that they were a lot of cultures had literacy for bookkeeping purposes and the like, court literacy, if you can call it that. This was a world, though, in which the Hellenistic world, in which literacy produced a library, if you will, that there was an intellectual tradition. The first great books that weren't just sagas of creation myths of different cultures, the first great books of scientific interest, medical interest, philosophical interest, economic interest, were books written in Greek. And so Greek became, if not the first language anywhere outside of the islands in the Greek mainland, it was certainly the lingua franca. It was certainly the French of the 18th century or the English of the 21st century. It was the Latin of the Middle Ages. It was the language spoken or read by everybody who made a claim to culture and to being cultivated. And this Greek world had a tremendous influence in the Jewish world and on Judaism. And one of the characteristics in this period is always going to be a battle between the conservatives or the zealots and traditionalists on one hand, who want to resist Greek influence, and the, if you will, the assimilationists who invited and decide to see the Hebrew Torah through the eyes of this curriculum. So a translation of the Hebrew Bible is made into Koine Greek, common Greek, man on the street Greek, Demotic Greek, called the Septuagint. In fact, the earliest remnants of manuscripts that we have of Torah are Greek excerpts from the Septuagint that are 5 to 6 centuries older than the oldest Hebrew text that we actually physically can get our hands on, the so-called Masoretic text. And if this Greek version was made in the 3rd century BCE, the heartland of the Hellenistic influence, and a Jewish tradition, intellectual tradition that was well-versed in Greek philosophy, flourished in the great university towns of Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in what is now Syria. And as you know, the Greek library at Alexandria was the greatest single library in the ancient world, and probably the greatest library ever constructed until the disaster when Julius Caesar wound up having to burn it down as a diversion to save his army. So these were cities, Alexandria and Antioch, of tremendous importance to early Christianity. And I want to stress this. Christianity is going to have feet, the development of early Christianity is going to have feet in both the Jewish tradition and the Hellenized versions of Judaism and other kinds of thought. And so early Christianity is going to have its greatest successes in the urban areas of that part of the world with their embedded Greek roots. In fact, the first attempted synthesis of Torah and Greek philosophy was made by the great Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lives in the 1st century AD, or he makes it to the 1st century. He's born. In fact, he was probably maybe 15, as far as we can ascertain, he was maybe 15 years older than Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, who's not born in the year 0, but who was born in the year 6 or 7 BC, because the calendars had to get corrected. The Gregorian calendar says, oh, we have to correct for about 6 years of false readings. Anyhow, in the Judaism of this period, meaning the period of the Second Temple, after the Babylonian captivity, we have the phenomenon of the prophetic tradition, in which, and it's in this period that the God of Israel becomes the one true God. In other words, monotheism as a concept is really developed. There is a sophistication in Jewish thought in this period. And although historically, the argument of when Isaiah was actually extant, for instance, the arguments are often that he was there earlier. The documents attributed to the prophet Isaiah were refined during this period. So the actual books of prophecy and the so-called major prophets, simply because they wrote more. It doesn't necessarily speak to precedents, even though it leans in that direction. And Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are all depicted, of course, on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, because they're all of great significance to Christian development in the early period. So the biblical texts of these major prophets are products of the period that begins with the Babylonian exile. And they foretell the fall and destruction of Jerusalem as a result of the sins of its people and their punishment by a just God. And as I said earlier, this is the period in which Yahweh has morphed from the God of Israel, a tribal God, into a kind of metaphysical only God. The tone of Jeremiah and the Book of Lamentations, which is also a prophetic book, even though it's not given the name of a person, in particular is particularly dire, and they reflect the tradition of communal lament, the kinah in Hebrew, that you find in other Near Eastern literatures. Oh, what has happened to us as a group? We have fallen very far, but there is hope. The just God is also merciful and will not only return his properly chastened people to their promised land, but he's also going to provide a Mashiach, a Messiah, a liberating king who will rebuild the temple and restore his people to their former chosen status. So this is the period in which Messianism really takes root and is going to be the central, if you will, hinge point between Judaism and early Christianity. So this Mashiach, the Melech Mashiach, King Messiah, is an anointed Savior King in the mold of David and Solomon. And you see that little Syrian 3rd century fresco from the modern period of Samuel anointing David. This is the context in which the Messiah was expected. He will unite the 12 tribes of Israel and ultimately usher in a messianic age of global peace and glory. And so we read in the book of Isaiah, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Along with this, and underpinning the assumption of a Messiah coming, is that this coming is the world to come, or end days. It's eschatology, as the Greek word would have it, for the last things, eschatolos, and the study of it, the logos. And that originally indicated, when it was first considered, a future earthly paradise that would replace the flawed current world. We'll be back in power. We'll be back on top. It says it'll be even better than when Moses led us across the Sinai and brought us into Canaan, the land of Canaan. It did not initially indicate concepts of an afterlife or heaven, but the idea of immortality, the idea that this was suggested in effect, resurrection was going to be suggested in the idea of a returning Messiah, begins to develop late in the Second Temple period, perhaps after 200 BCE. And it's exactly the idea of individual immortality that gets suggested. And we'll look at these texts in Isaiah and Daniel in a second. But I want to point out that it is exactly in this period that these ideas of immortality, individual immortality, are springing up all over this part of the world, Jewish and non-Jewish. The Gentile world was filled with, as we'll talk about later on, with ideas that spring out of fertility cults that were associated with the rebirth of the crops, and we can talk about Greek mythological precedents for this, but that has thought in, as the Greek curriculum entrenched itself, and as thought, philosophical consideration became ever more sophisticated, the mythic content begins to morph into an actual argument that human life might be able to achieve immortality, that the yearning was not just that the crop would return, that the symbolism of Persephone coming back out of Hades, released to join her mother in the overworld after her winter sojourn in the underworld, was really a kind of mythic reading of the yearning to live forever. And so we find in Isaiah this quote, "But your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead." The earth will give birth to her dead. And from Daniel, "And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. And at that time, thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book of predestined survival. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Now, late in this period, there is the Maccabean revolt, which actually it's a Jewish clan, the Maccabees, that revolt against the weakened Greek Seleucid Empire, the kingdom, I should say. It's not really an empire. And they rise up against the Hellenizing Jews. This is kind of a conservative movement. And it leads to the establishment of a Judean state, which incorporates several neighboring regions like Samaria and Galilee and Idumea, all of which were contiguous with Judah. They're all part of what is now Israel. And they were all contiguous with the kingdom of Judah. But all of these people, all of whom, by the way, thought of themselves as being rooted at some way or another in the Abrahamic and Mosaic tradition. The people from Samaria, the so-called Samaritans, actually claim as much ancient rootedness in Torah as traditional Judaism did and does. So it becomes kind of a prototype for Israel, and for about a half a century, between 110 and 63 BCE, it actually is independent because the Seleucid Empire has recently collapsed under pressure from the Parthians to the east, and you see on the map on the middle of the page on the left, you see that Parthia is going to lean on the Seleucid Empire from the east, and from the west, the Roman Republic, you'll see up way in the left-hand corner of this, actually by 188, they were already dominating traditional Greeks, even though they hadn't established their tradition of setting up colonial governments in these places, but they would very soon, as we shall see. And that little map on the right shows how, over time, how the Maccabees unified Israel for the short period before the arrival of Rome. And of course, this exacerbates Jewish yearning for independence. So when the Romans arrive in 63 BC, the Imperator Pompey the Great, Pompeius, leaves his house on the Pincio in Rome, leads an army in the east. He makes the Hasmonian state a client kingdom of Rome. And by 37 BC, an Idumean, Herod the Great, was designated king of the Jews by the Roman state, and the Herodian dynasty was born. And of course, the Roman world and the Herodians are going to be, for many of the conservative Jewish and traditional Jewish elements, a source of acrimony. They're under the heel again. Now, some background. The Hasmonian period was one of great political, ethnic, religious volatility. The fundamental and modern problem of whether Judaism was a political identity as well as a religious identity became a defining issue in this period. Religious and ideological purists rejected Greek philosophy, science, and culture, mere novelties, which was much the fashion in educated circles in all the cities of the Levant, not so much the rural areas, but certainly in the cities. Arguments about religious observance and liturgy were debated in the wake of the historical disruptions of the Babylonian captivity and the rebuilding of the temple. There were Jews who never credited the second temple with the authority that the first temple had, mainly because, as part of the Babylonian captivity, without temple worship, without the priestly class, the Kohanim, the Cohens, the Kohanes, without them performing sacrifice and tribal liturgy built around temple sacrifice, the leadership of the groups in exile fell into the hands of local scholars, the forerunners of rabbis, and the oral tradition of interpretation, the whole tradition of Talmud, is going to begin with the Babylonian captivity and is going to become an accretion that is regarded by some, not by all, as we will see in a moment, by some as having the same level of authority as the written Torah itself. So this oral tradition, it's the invention of the shul, it's the invention of the synagogue, the coming together, a place for study. We don't have a temple, but we can still come together and keep the traditions of the sacred text alive and elucidate them through an oral tradition of interpretation and refinement. So it's in this period also that Judeans clash with Samaritans, who considered themselves the true heirs of the ancient Israelites. By the birth of Christ, so by the late 1st century BC or BCE, there are three identifiable intellectual traditions that have emerged within Judaism. The first of these, the so-called Sadducees, the Saddukaioi in Greek, or the Saddukim. The name derives from Zadok, who is the first high priest of Israel and the ancestor of the Kohanim, the aristocratic priestly caste, which is still, genetic testing has indicated that 10% or so of all Jews in the world have a gene in common that's identified with inclusion in the tradition of the Kohanim. Their role in temporal worship gave them very high profile. So these were the rich, important VIP leadership class of the late Second Temple period. They had prominence in political affairs. They had prominence in civil affairs. On the issue of written versus oral Torah, the Sadducees regarded the written Torah, the Pentateuch, the first five, the Greek word for the first five books, Genesis and Exodus, etc., as the sole source of divine revelation. Later books, including the prophets, were not included. They saw these as later accretions. This was not part of the original tradition. Back in their glory days, when there was still the first temple, there were only the first five books around, really. They also rejected the elaborate oral Torah tradition, what we know collectively as the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the commentaries of the Gemara. This was the tradition of interpretations, rules, moral guidance that was not written down until after the fall of the Second Temple in 70 AD, because it was after the fall of the Second Temple that the great Jewish diaspora, migrations of Jews everywhere as the Romans took it out on the locals, created a diaspora that threatened the loss of traditional culture. So what had easily remained a close-knit oral tradition of education built into the fabric of Jewish life, much like the American Great Westward Expansion, there's a panic that a loss of culture is threatened. So we better write this stuff down. So it's in this period that Talmud is written, and then commentaries are written into the margins of Talmud, and those become extensions of the Talmud, and rabbis for the next 20 centuries comment on the comments on the comments on the comments of the original oral tradition. The Sadducees are conservative and cosmopolitan. They were the winners. They're the country club. As the keepers and beneficiaries of the temple tradition, they are scripturally literalist. Hey, this text puts us in the catbird seat, and so we're going to pretty much adhere to the dictates of the traditional text. Now, as leaders who are most exposed to the influence of Hellenism, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the Romans were all bearers of the Greek curriculum. So whoever was dominating Israel at this point was lodged. They were representatives of the Greek curriculum, and being exposed to this upper class crust embraced concepts that were consistent with that Greek curriculum. So the concept of free will and the concept of resurrection is actually rejected by them, because it's certainly outside of Plato. It's certainly in none of the Aristotelian texts, for instance, is it taken seriously. And so the Greek curriculum itself was not, it was sort of the underground religious traditions from the Greek world that spawned concepts of resurrection. But the Sadducees embrace free will, reject the concept of resurrection. The second group, the Pharisees, Pharisaios, it seems that the name Pharisee derives from the Aramaic, and Aramaic was the Demotic language spoken in Israel and Palestine in general. It's very closely related to Old Syriac, and it's Aramaic for separated or set apart. And we're not sure why they were associated with that name. It may reflect their opposition to Hellenism, the Gentile influences, and their opposition to the limited literalist Judaism of the Sadducees. Now, these were the keepers of the early rabbinic tradition. And although there are some sections of the early Gospels where a couple of the Pharisees wind up looking in the evangelists' rendering, they look like bad guys. They are in many places, even in the Gospels, good guys. And indeed, several early Christian players of significance, like St. Paul of Tarsus, called him, even after his conversion, he calls himself a Pharisee. These were the serious students. These were the sages. They were the class of scribes and keepers of the growing oral tradition and the early writing down of that tradition. These prototypes for the rabbi, which means teacher or master, claimed that interpreting and explicating Torah was central to the Mosaic legacy. Their moral authority was such that both Jewish and Christian sources in the first century cited the popularity that the Pharisees had with common people. These were people who were considered the ethical ones, the standard bearers. And so we set up a tension between the newer tradition of the synagogue versus the older tradition of the temple. The second temple was built under foreign auspices and therefore was suspect. The emerging rabbinic tradition replaced the temple with the Torah as the central institution of Judaism. During the captivity, as I mentioned before, the locus of assembly and study and prayer was the synagogue or the shul. Now, the Pharisees, on issues of atonement and judgment, temple sacrifice performed by priests to appease a just and angry God had been a corporate activity. The people of Israel, in that case, were atoning and purifying as a body. The switch away from the focus on the temple and temple ritual was towards individual, not group or corporate atonement, individual atonement and individual purification, or, as I point out here in modern idiom, personal religion. It's the Pharisees that developed the tradition of Judaism as a personal religion, and that the individual becomes a man or woman of conscience. The Pharisees believed that Jewish law and observance applied to every individual Jew, not just us as a group being led by a high priest to go sacrifice a bull. On issues of resurrection and immortality, certainly by 200 BCE, and certainly by the slightly later Hasmonian era, the Pharisaical position of personal responsibility and personal atonement was logically linked to the concepts of resurrection and individual immortality. If an individual should be pure, should be observant, should be morally good in some sense, there should be a reward for that and a punishment for the reverse. And of course, immortality, as the prophetic tradition indicated, individual immortality is a cogent answer to the problem. It becomes the kind of reward for the righteous that the great judging God would provide. So they were believers in versions of resurrection and immortality. The Essenes are the third group. We had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essaioi. The etymology of the term is unknown. Somebody suggested, I was searching online for this, that it may derive or some term for holy in some dialect. They flourish in the last 2 centuries BCE and are believed to have been an offshoot of the priestly caste, oddly enough, that they become this reform element, this kind of monastic impulse within the class of the Sadducees. They're famously associated with asceticism. They practiced asceticism in community form, much like Christian monasteries will within the next, as early as the next century. They practiced voluntary poverty, purification by immersion, baptism. Remember John the Baptist, who's the cousin of Jesus, who in a famous episode baptizes, and Christ comes to him for a baptism, comes to him for a ritual immersion. He comes to the mikveh for purification. And celibacy, which had been a characteristic of Zadokite priests once upon a time, is associated with Essene communities. So there is this isolation of physical motive. One lives for a pure, higher objective and on a pure, higher spiritual plane. It's the assumption. The famous Qumran archaeology site from where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls is clearly an Essene community. And we have texts that suggest certain influences of Christian writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there are lots of strange things there that people are still trying to find their way through, that suggests strong influence on Christian sentiment in the next century. The asceticism and water purification of John the Baptist suggests that he may have been educated in one of these communities. Now, they are also associated with mysticism. Much of Essene practice was essentially secret and reserved for initiates. So a mysterium in Greek is a holy thing that should only be approached by someone who is sufficiently purified to not tarnish or sully the sacred thing. And the word for initiate is mistai, or initiates, that's the plural. Mistai. And mysticism is generally defined as the keeping of secret knowledge. The door to higher truth was entered through purification and self-discipline. I mean, basically, this is almost a textbook for monastic life being defined here in the Jewish world. Those who achieved higher knowledge, the elect in the Essene groups, they were actually called the sons of light. So they were filled with this light, dark, metaphorical imagery that will come to dominate Christianity. Now, there's several overlaps with Christianity. The practice of baptism, we mentioned already, a ritual meal of bread and wine instituted by the Messiah is involved in Essene practice. The belief in a coming day of judgment. There are echoes of the Qumran text in the Gospels. So from the so-called Son of God text, from the Qumran text, the quote, "He will be called great and he will be called Son of God, and they will call him Son of the Most High. He will judge the earth in righteousness and every nation will bow down to him." Compare this to this selection from the Gospel of Luke. "And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, the Son of God." Parallels all over the place. The Essenes believed in immortality and punishment for sin. They did not accept the resurrection of the physical body. Body was a slightly impure element for them, so it was a kind of spiritual resurrection that was going to take place. Their attitudes towards the body and marriage echo both St. Paul and the Gnostic traditions, which we'll talk about in a later class. Gnostic are Christians. It's a belief system associated with certain elements that are often considered heterodox or heretical in early Christianity and are heavily influenced by certain Asiatic and Persian traditions. That's for later. But St. Paul's attitude towards the body and marriage were quite similar to Essene assumptions. Moving on. Now let's turn to the actual early Christian tradition to look for more parallels with the shape that Judaism was taking in this period. The Gospels, the core documents of early Christianity. The Gospels are Kerygma and Evangelion. In other words, the apostolic mission, the group, the apostolos means messenger, the early messengers were there to proclaim. Kerygma means a proclamation. And the content of what they were there to proclaim was the so-called good news, Evangelion, from which we get the word evangelist in both Latin and English later on. The four canonical Gospels, there were others written, but there were four that early Christianity finally, when it separates everything out, says, these are the ones we're willing to vouch for, not the others, were not written until more than 40 years after the death of Christ, which would have been in approximately 27 AD, after factoring in the calendar corrections. So Mark was written, most likely, the closest we get is 66 to 70 of the first century AD. Matthew and Luke, somewhere ballpark around 85 or 90 AD. And John, the Gospel of John, well after, somewhere in the 90 to 110 AD. The oral preaching tradition, in other words, was around for close to 2 generations before there was anything written down. And so this becomes the central core of early Christian teaching. And the core of that core is the narrative of the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, who then becomes identified as Christos, which is the Greek for Mashiach. It's the Greek translation of the word Messiah. So it's Jesus the Messiah. And the core of the story is built around the redemption narrative, if you will, the passion, the suffering, the death, and on the third day he rises. Now, the first 3 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, are called synoptic because you could lay them out next to each other, top to bottom, as if you were cross-referencing 3 lists, and they follow a lot in order. Certainly, by the time you get to the passion, death, and resurrection narrative, they completely follow each other. But they also, the 3 different synoptic gospels, also add other stuff that are clearly based on the oral tradition. There's some stuff about Christ's genealogy and birth. We get birth stories, we get the manger, we get the 3 magi, the Persian priests showing up. We get anecdotes of Christ's life, his early childhood, very little, but a little bit, his teaching. We get a lot about miracles. We're changing water into wine. We're raising Lazarus from the dead, etc. But then you come to the central passion narrative and everything is common again. Now, there is a theory that Luke and Matthew may be based on Mark and a second so-called missing source that they call Q in the tradition. And I won't take you into that discourse because there's a lot of text analysis going into that. This image on the right, this little chart, let me focus that. Okay, this color-coded map represents what is common to each of them, what is common to any group of subset of two of them, and what is unique to any of the three. So Mark, for instance, there is only this little itty bitty part, 3% or so of Mark, that is absolutely unique to Mark. You don't find it in any of the other documents, which suggests that he may have come first, because then the others copied most of the other stuff or reinterpreted most of the other stuff. The core that overlaps all three, so the so-called triple tradition, 76% of Mark maps to 41% of Luke, which maps to 46% of Matthew. And so what we have here is, this is the passion and death and resurrection that they all have in common. There is a little bit of Mark that overlaps with Luke, like 1% of Luke and 3%, that's that orange thing. There is a larger share of Matthew, 10% of Matthew overlaps with about 18% of Mark. Then if we come down to Luke, there's about 35% of Luke. And Luke was, as far as we can tell, most likely, or if not immediately, it's possible that it was written originally in Greek. All of these others were written in Aramaic to begin with. Mark certainly, but Luke, we'll talk about him more, is somebody who's clearly from the Hellenistic world, whoever Luke is. The writer we like to call Luke. 35% of Luke is unique to Luke. 23% of Luke overlaps with 24% of Matthew. Well, if they both were sort of simultaneous and influenced by Mark, that might likely be the case, and only 20% of Matthew is unique to Matthew. So, very useful chart. The Gospel of John is not mentioned here because John's Gospel, and we will talk about this in next week's class, John's Gospel is written later and is an early attempt at a theological interpretation of the story of Christ, which is why John is sometimes called John the Divine, like the cathedral up on 112th Street, because in the lingo of the King James Version of the Bible, if we go back to Elizabethan times, in England, divine was the word used for a theologian. So it's a way of saying John the theologian, John the divine, and it has a very different purpose, other than just communicating the core evangelion, the kerygma and the evangelion. So it's a very different sort of thing. The initial target audience for Christian preaching were Jews. The original target audience were Jews. Lots of the early converts were Pharisees. The oral kerygma and the first written gospels were in Aramaic, the Demotic language of the Jewish world. It isn't until later, as Christianity addresses the Gentiles, that they're translated into Greek. The Gospels take great pains to associate Christ with Jewish traditions and the messianic expectations of the prophets. So parallels and symbols abide everywhere. The Seder meal, the Last Supper, and we'll look at that more closely later on. God manifests in fire in Exodus, and little images of fire, the sacred presence. And at Pentecost, the apostles gathered together in the Acts of the Apostles with flames appearing over their head, is clearly a reference to the presence of God as a lip of fire. Christ, he fasts in the desert for 40 days. Well, 40 is everywhere in the Old Testament. The Exodus is 40 years. Noah, it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Because of the sacredness of the number 40, in the Middle Ages, when someone was thought to have plague, they would be sequestered for 40 days. And the word in Italian for 40 is quaranta. So they were quarantined because what the gospel is just speaks to us about the significance of the term 40. And that's the Old Testament. The house of David as a parallel between the Christian, the Jewish traditions. So the Gospel of Matthew begins, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, with a 17-verse, 42-generation genealogy running from Abraham through David to Christ. So I've boiled it down here to this couple of short quotes, but this is from the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. In the old King James Version, it's Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judah, etc. Then skip a whole bunch. And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers, at the time of the deportation to Babylon, and after the deportation to Babylon, etc., etc. And then later, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christos. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon were 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. So we have all of the great Christian numerology involved in one fell swoop. We have groups of three, suggesting the Trinity that is going to come in Christian theology. This image of the suffering servant, Christ as the suffering Messiah. So in Isaiah 53, the Messiah was also predicted to be rejected at first by his own people. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray, and each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He's going to be the sacrificial lamb, the bearer of the iniquity. He will be the scapegoat, the sacrificial lamb. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so did not open his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many. He will justify many and will bear their iniquities. Sonia raised the question in chat: is safe to say Abraham is the original Jew that we know is today? Well, arguably Adam, but certainly the Abraham is considered the father of the religious tradition. But now look at Matthew in book 20, echoing Isaiah. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are supposed to rule over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give us life as a ransom for many. So the suggested, what will follow as the explanation of why the redemption was necessary. The crucifixion is a guilt offering, the redemption for the sins of Adam. And Matthew takes great pains to say this is all over Isaiah. This is the one we as Jews have been expecting all this time. Now, the idea of resurrection and redemption, rebirth, and I have this image. This is a medieval jeweled covering of probably a reliquary or something. It shows saints rising from the dead out of their coffins, literally. The heart of the Evangelion, the distinctive claim, is the death and resurrection of Christ, the Messiah. Everything else, the wonder stories of miracles, the ethical teachings, the charismatic personality of Jesus, has significance only if the resurrection is real. For the evangelist, the clearest, bluntest explanation of what is at stake, repeated in many of his epistles to the faithful, came from the Apostle Paul, the messenger. And he says, and this is a quote from 1 Corinthians, Paul is charming to read only because of his bluntness. He never makes nice. He's always going right for the carotid artery. And here he does it again. For if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. And we apostles would all be lying about God, for we have said that God raised Christ from the grave. But that can't be true if there is no resurrection of the dead. And if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless. And here's the money shot. And you were still guilty of your sins. In that case, all who have died believing in Christ are lost. And if our hope in Christ is only for this life, we are more to be pitied than anyone in the world. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the first of a great harvest of all who have died. So you see, just as death came into the world through a man, Adam, now the resurrection from the dead has begun through another man. Just as everyone dies because we all belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life. So to the first generations of Christians, as I say in this box down at the bottom, Jews imbued with apocalyptic messianic expectations, the story of a promised, rejected, crucified Savior who nevertheless rose from the dead resonated. His sacrificial death merited salvation for the chosen people. So it becomes a story of eminent plausibility to whatever portion of Jews were open to immortality themes. And so a lot of early Christians did come from the Jewish world. But very soon it became clear, and we have a book in the New Testament about this, the so-called Acts of the Apostles, also written by the same guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke, whether that is Luke or not, the Praxeis Apostolon, the Acts of the Apostles. In this book, it's really about the first generation of Christians in the couple of decades following the resurrection, taking the message to the Gentiles. It was written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, and it's the primary source of the early church tradition to preach to the Gentiles. It's not just for the Jews. Now, a very central part of Acts of the Apostles, besides following people like Paul around and saying, here he is in Athens, and this is what he's preaching to the Athenians, a very central part is what is referred to later on as the first great council of leaders of the Christian church, the so-called Council of Jerusalem, more or less around 50 AD, which is clearly a generation after the death of Christ. Several of the Pharisees, Jewish scholars who were early converts, argued that the Gentiles, the non-Jewish converts who converted to Christianity, had to observe Jewish law and submit, to be consistent, to circumcision. Now, this is a hard sell. At the summit, because this is not infant circumcision, this is adult circumcision. At a summit of the senior apostles, Peter and Paul intervened at this point. And so now I'm quoting from the Acts of the Apostles. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. The apostles and the elders, the presbyters, the elders, were gathered together to see about this matter. When there had been much discussion, Peter rose up and said to them, brothers, you know that a good while ago God made a choice among you that by my mouth the nations should hear the word of the good news and believe. Peter had this special designation. You're going to be from which the idea of the papacy derives. I'm making you the chief. God, who knows the heart, testified about them, giving them the Holy Spirit, just like he did to us. He made no distinction between us and them, cleansing their hearts by faith. Now, therefore, why do you tempt God that you should put a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? Why do you make them follow every letter of Torah, which we weren't very good at to begin with? But we believe that we are saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, just as they are. And all the multitude kept silence, and they listened to Barnabas and Paul reporting what signs and wonders God had done among the nations, the Gentiles. The Latin word for clan is gens or gens, and gentes is the plural. So the Gentiles were the clans out there. Therefore, my judgment is that we don't trouble those among the Gentiles who turn to God, but that we write to them that we'll give them some basic rules. We'll write to them that they abstain from the pollution of idols, from sexual immorality, from what is strangled, and from blood. So some of the ritual observances. For Moses from generations of old has in every city those who preach him, being read in the synagogues every Shabbat. So that we can create a world in which the Gentiles feel comfortable mixing in on these early Christian communities, which will look very Jewish to them when they first walk in the door. Okay. And Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles, as he is called, a significant great man, of course, his backstory is that he is the zealous Pharisee who is running and who's Hellenized. He speaks Greek as well as Aramaic, and he's running around the Levantine world. He's going up to what would now be Syria and places in Turkey to persecute this new heresy that's following the cult of this rabbi they call Jesus. And he's really there in opposition to the Christians when, as the lore has it, he's knocked off his horse by a bolt of lightning and a voice. He hears a voice in the sky that says, "Why are you persecuting me and my people?" And on the spot, he's blinded, he's taken into a town, and he realizes the voice is the voice of God talking to him, and he converts. And here is one of the great Caravaggio paintings of Paul getting knocked off his horse on the way to Damascus. This is from, I believe this one is in Santa Maria del Popolo. It's one of the two Caravaggios in the church. And true to Caravaggio, Paul's on the ground, but the groom for the horse, and the horse are at least as interesting in the picture as Paul is. But the depth of Paul, the man contemplating the message is I suppose much more apparent in this Rembrandt on the right. But Paul is one of the lionized figures in early Christianity. One of the great papal churches in Rome is St. Paul's outside the walls, San Paolo. And of course, if we look at the map of just Paul's journeys at mid to late first century AD, before he is himself martyred, he is everywhere, and his epistles are epistles to the Romans, epistles to the Galatians, epistles to the Colossians, and you can see the names of all these place names of where there were early Christian communities, and he's writing the folks so that they don't backslide, so that they can be reconfirmed in their faith all the time. Now it will become, and we'll talk about this going forward, it'll become a crisis to many in the first generation of Christian converts who expected that Christ's second coming would be in their lifetimes, when all of a sudden a lot of the apostolic generation started dying off, no Christ coming back. And a kind of theology to explain this had to be elaborated as it went forward. But all these early stops in the heartland, and it's what I want to really point out here, in the heartland of the Greek, now controlled by Rome, but the world of the Greek curriculum, all through the Ionic, the cultivated Ionic cities. Ionia was the Greek world, settled from Athens on the west coast of Turkey, through Athens, through Delphi, and then, of course, to the city of Rome itself. But the center of early Christianity is in the Eastern Mediterranean, has nothing to do with Rome. Very little to do with Rome. We'll talk about that when we get there. This is the center. And Paul, as the Hellenized Jew, the Jew who spoke the language and the idiom of those who were born to the curriculum, he makes his great conversions in that part of the world. Now, that part of the world, and I mentioned this earlier, was steeped, going back centuries, in various different mystery religions that were born out of fertility cults. Since the time of Alexander, that world, Western Asia, North Africa, Greater Greece, had spawned several mystery religions that derived from the earliest rituals of agricultural birth and renewal. The Hellenistic period, under the influence of more sophisticated religious and philosophical approaches, for example, the Pythagoreans and Plato himself, these fertility cults were transformed into religions of personal salvation. And probably my favorite, whoops, I jumped ahead there by mistake. My favorite artifact in the Metropolitan Museum is you see it on the first floor as you walk through the Greek area, going left from the main entrance, as you pass through all the Greek craters on the way to the Romans. The great Eleusinian relief from the great Eleusinian mystery cult. Here's Demeter and the cereal goddess, her daughter Persephone, who is abducted into the underworld by Hades, and then after much bargaining, she's allowed to come back for part of the year, and that's spring and summer and the fall. And it's the son, Triptolemus. So this was a rebirth religion of sorts based on an older fertility cult with magical secret symbols. We don't know a whole lot about it because everybody was sworn to secrecy. It was, they were better than the Masons. Consistent with the ethical norms of early philosophy, salvation required purification, catharsis, before the initiates, the mystai, could be introduced to the mystery proper. Now, Saul of Tarsus, St. Paul, he's one familiar with all these traditions, as well as the messianic prophecy for their inclusion in the world to come. And the Gentiles become his mission. And we have a quote allegedly ascribed to Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. God made the nation so they would seek him. God overlooks ignorance of these things in times past, but now directs everyone everywhere to change their hearts and lives. This is because God has set a day when he intends to judge the world justly by a man he has appointed. God has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And he's speaking to people who know that the mystery cults are about the risen God, the God who rises, who comes back from the underworld. So to educated Athenians, the changing of their hearts and lives is an echo of Platonism, and the resurrection of Christ is reminiscent of the rebirth of Persephone from the underworld. In other words, it isn't that any of the actual forms of early Christianity, like the rituals or cult worship, was directly adopted from mystery religion. But Mediterranean mystery religion among the Gentiles made the ground fertile, if you will, for the idea of a risen God. I don't think that Christianity would have had the appeal that it did in certain non-Jewish quarters, except for that. And so the Greek mystery religion tradition played its role in developing a fertilized soil for the conversion. Now, one final slide, and then if you have questions or want to talk about anything. The Christian mysteries. Now, the central Christian mystery is the Mass. The Mass is a later word. It comes from the Latin for the last line of the Mass, where the priest says, Ite missa est, go, it is sent, it's done, it's consummated, it's over. The Greek churches and many of the Asian churches they call it the sacred liturgy, the liturgos. It's the central sacred rite and the central sacrament, if you will, of Christianity, the Eucharist, the liturgy of the Eucharist. It's the rite that's built around the Last Supper texts of the Synoptic Gospels, and it reflects Hellenistic attitudes towards mystery. And the reason it does, if you look at the structure of the Mass, there are whether it's the Roman Mass or any other of the African or Asian rites, the Ethiopian Mass, the Chaldean Mass, they all, from the first 2 centuries, have exactly the same structure. There is an initial phase, sometimes called the Roman Church, called it the liturgy of the word, or it also is referred to in Catholic circles as the Mass of the catechumens, who were the ones studying to become observers, the students. And in the liturgy of the word, readings are made. They're prayers and the readings. The readings are from the Gospels, from the epistles of some of the other apostles, like Paul's epistles, James. There's a sermon, a homily, a lecture, if you will. There's an intercessionary prayer, purify our hearts, O Lord, so that we can receive what is about to come with the right disposition. Now, those who weren't fully yet initiated, and this is something that it probably picks up from the mystery cults, those who were not yet properly initiated or purified, that is, baptized, had to leave the Mass at this point before the sacred mystery, that which must be kept a secret, that which had power, and which was what was to come, the liturgy of the Eucharist, the commemorative meal of Christ's body and blood that is at once a sacrifice, a redemptive sacrifice, and a meal. It consists of the offering and the consecration, doing the deed. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, hic est enim corpus meo, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So it is the meal that is simultaneously the sacrifice. And in the Middle Ages, when, for reasons that I'll get a chance to talk to some later part in the course, when the priest at the Mass would have his back to the congregation rather than facing them as he does in the modern world, or as he did in the ancient world. In the medieval world, the peasants faced the back of the priest, if you will. And the words of consecration, hic est enim corpus meum, but this is my body, hoc est calix sanguinis meae, this is the cup of my blood, were said in Latin very low, so that only those very near the priest could hear it, and the congregation was sheltered from being presented with the Latin, which they didn't speak anyhow, themselves, until all they heard was the words of consecration, hic est enim corpus meum, which from a distance sounded, hoc est enim calix sanguinis meae, which from a distance sound like and was where the phrase comes from, hocus pocus, because it was seen as a magical act, the turning of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. So here is Leonardo's famous Last Supper mural. And I can blend that up a little bit. And here is an early Christian agape. Agape is a Greek word for the kind of communal love that the meal was a reflection of, with the meal in front of them in an ancient church fresco from probably about the 4th century, 3rd or 4th century. Anyhow, with that done, I am going to stop sharing and remove the pin. And brothers and sisters, here we are. Any observations, any comments? Anything anybody wants to talk about?
Hey, Lou. Hi. First of all, thank you. Always enjoy your lectures. It's very interesting. Learn a lot. The breadth of it is a little intimidating sometimes, I admit, but very interesting. I'm kind of surprised. I didn't really realize that a lot of some of the, the I don't want to say sects, but the kind of the small groups, the groups of Christians that kind of had their own the way of looking at things, like the Carthaginians or, some of the Puritans. A lot of that, not fanaticism, but that whether it's, chastity, even in marriage, or celibacy, or a lot of it has that Jewish roots. That it's really just a rehashing of some of the things that existed from the very beginning in Judaism. So I found that very interesting.
I think the Essene tradition, that was true of the Essenes. I don't think it was true of the Pharisaical tradition at all. But
there's different versions, and all of those different versions somehow repercolate again in Christianity, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I think Christianity picks up more about what shall I say, the superiority of the spiritual to the physical, and the tendency to regard sexuality as a danger point. I think it picks up even more of that from Hellenistic and what we will look at next week from other sources outside of Judaism. In other words, it's fed that more from the non-Jewish world, I think, even though there was an element of that in the Jewish world. But we'll talk.
More to come.
Okay, lots more to come. We will spend 2 more sessions will be spent on the next 5 centuries of the Roman world. So we have a lot to go on there.
Thanks, Lou.
You're welcome. I'm glad to find that I'm still capable of intimidation. I thought I'd lost my chops somewhere about 20 years ago.
Lou, I'm interested in your opinion. I've read where Christianity probably would not have become as big as it became, or has spread as much as it had, without Paul. Paul was the true driver of the religion.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think he was the true driver because he understood how it could not just be a Jewish extension. And he convinced, the one thing about that little Council of Jerusalem section that I read that is slightly misleading is that at another point earlier, Paul points out that even Peter wasn't clear on this point. So Paul had to talk Peter into it before they then take that argument back to the community at large. And so Paul is really the driver that this is, and he's the one who understood that this and makes the case for, in Matthew and Mark, you get the idea of Christianity fulfilling Torah mandate. That Christianity is, in a sense, a kind of culmination of the Torah tradition. Paul is the one who starts regarding this concept of the resurrection as completely superseding it. It's nice that there's a continuity of tradition. However, guess what? It doesn't count. It's all about the act of the sacrifice of Christ. And so he's very Greek in this way. I know he's a Pharisee, but he's got to be the most Greek Pharisee ever produced. Good point, though.
Yes.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Just to pick up a little bit on the Paul thing, remind us again what languages he spoke throughout those travels.
He would have been speaking Greek in those
He
places,
would be speaking Greek.
unless he was speaking to a largely Jewish community,
Then it would be Aramaic.
or
Hebrew.
Greek,
Oh,
depending on how old or recent a Jewish community that was.
mhm.
So if he's speaking to communities in places like, those cities in Turkey that were Jewish centers at the time, my guess is, I'm reaching here, but I'm going to take a wild guess and say these might be communities of people who speak some version of Aramaic at home and Greek for most of their work life.
But they would have been in Turkey because of the diaspora after the Second Temple. And
But this is even before the fall of the Second Temple.
What, from Babylonian dispersion? What would they do
I don't
in
know.
Turkey?
Yeah, there may have been some early migrants. Certainly, those communities really build only after 70 AD. But we have reason to believe that Paul got to some of these places before then.
Mhm. I just wanted that the other thing that I didn't understand is that I don't really understand when you talk about a mystery religion, that's not the paganism of the Hellenistic.
It is a
world.
pagan. It is a paganism.
But
Because-
what's different about it? It's just that it's a secret and you have to be initiated.
Yes, that it's very much a formal cult with rules. It's not just the worship of Zeus in a temple down the block, for instance.
So
These were like,
when you talk about the mystery religions in the Levant or wherever they were, or in Greece, would they the same one widespread, or would be like one little neighborhood would have one mystery religion? And I don't understand what that
these
was.
were not they weren't everywhere. They were fairly isolated. They
Okay.
would have been around sacred sites like Delphi
Okay.
or Eleusis, the island of Eleusis. They would have been associated, like in the Roman world, there was have you ever been to Cumae in Italy, which is that town outside of Naples, where there was a Sibyl, somebody like an oracle. It was like Delphi. And you went and you purified yourself for 3 days before you could enter the cave of the Sibyl and present the Sibyl or the priestess with the question that you wanted the answer to, as like Delphi. And there were strict rules for admission, and you had to, so around the Mediterranean, there were numbers of things like that.
Okay. Thanks.
Anyhow, next week, we'll pursue it to the next step. Okay, gang.
Very enlightening. Yes.
Take care.
Thanks, Lou.